welcome everybody to our webinar on assessing grid health. My name's Marcus Stewart, and I'm Head of Secretariat for the Green Grids Initiative, and I'll be your host today, and I'll be chairing this call. So I'm delighted to say that we've got three really interesting presentations on the work that has been undertaken to look at grid metrics and grid health across Asia Pacific, Africa, and Latin America. So we just move forward to the agenda slide, and I'll take you through how the webinar is going to progress today. So I'll be giving a short introduction. It'll then be followed by Dan Hamza-Goodacre from the Pooled Fund for International Energy, and he will explain a little bit around the purpose of the study, because the fund commissioned the work, and then we'll run into the main part of the presentation, which is the three presentations from each region. So we'll start off with Latin America, then move on to Africa, and then Asia Pacific, and then at the end we'll have time for Q&A. So the way the Q&A works is, unfortunately, participants can't speak, so you will have to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll pick them through. So as we go through the chat, through the sessions, please put your questions in there, and then at the end of the presentations, we'll start the Q&A and pick up those questions and any other questions that come along, and deal with those, and hopefully we'll get lots of interactive questions. The presenters and the organisations that have undertaken the work are really keen to get input and views on the value of the work that they've done, you know, where it could be taken forward, and such and so forth. So we're really keen to get that input today. So please don't be shy about putting your questions through. So another thing to note is that we will be sending out copies of the presentations, so those will be available, and also following the presentation, if there's further follow-ups or interest that you have in the work of any of the organisations or the work in general, both the presenters and ourselves, GGI, will be happy to sort of connect with you and follow up offline. So that's the plan for today. I'm going to move us through now into my short introduction. Next slide, please. So yeah, so I'd like to say welcome from the Green Grids Initiative, and I'll tell you a little bit about who the Green Grids Initiative are if you haven't come across us before. So our role in life is really to help accelerate the delivery of grids globally to enable the energy transition, because as it says there, there's no transition without transmission. And why are grids so important to the transition? Well, next slide, please. Here are a few facts just to you know, bring you up to speed on that. So we need to we've had commitments to triple renewable energy by 2030 at COP28, and also commitments to double grids by 2030 at the same time. And why do we need to do that? Well, you know, there's a number of reasons. You know, grids take a long time to build. It takes at least 10 years or longer to build grids, whereas the renewable energy can be built a lot quicker. So we need to ensure the grids are there in time. There's around 3,000 gigawatts of renewable energy projects stuck in connection queues globally already. So the grids clearly are not getting built fast enough. And you know, we need to increase that investment from around $300 billion today to around $800 billion by 2030. So there's a huge uptick in investment and work required to deliver that transmission for the transition. But there are also fundamental problems as well. So in emerging and developing markets, only around 40% of grid projects would be eligible for climate finance. So access to finance to grid projects is an issue, and the funding models is an issue. So these things need to be addressed, and those are the things that we do and we look at in the Green Grids Initiative. If you move over to the next slide, please. So what do we do? Well, GGI, we bring together a global network of organizations to focus on these challenge areas and turn these challenges into enablers for grids. There are three key areas of focus. So one is around funding and finance. So how can we help the grids become more attractive and easier to finance? So we're doing a huge amount of work on climate finance to try and unlock some of that capital, which will then make it easier for private finance to feed into grids. So again, access to finance is a key issue that we work on, and we have a finance working group, and we're also working on this across the regional work groups that we operate in. Planning and operation, as I alluded to earlier, it takes around 10 years to build grids. It actually takes a couple of years to do the physical build. So a lot of the challenges are around planning, permitting, and getting public acceptance. So what can we do to move that on? So some countries are doing this better than others. So one of the things that we look at is how can we share that knowledge and best practice, and the same with operation as well. As countries are getting higher and higher renewable grids, they're discovering how to operate them, how to balance those grids, how to ensure they've got the right planning, but also the right ancillary services to make those grids operate in a secure and robust way. So, what we want to do there is, share that best practice and help countries and organizations learn from each other and share that through peer-to-peer knowledge sharing and codifying, the experience of, organizations that are at the forefront of the transition. And then thirdly, in order to build the grids, you need to have the capacity in the supply chain to do that. And we know that certainly for transmission, there is a limited pool of supply chain. And so that needs to ramp up. That needs confidence to do that. That needs pipelines. Things like standardization of technology also will help. So again, we facilitate dialogues between governments and regions with the supply chain industry to look at how we can build those pipelines and create that certainty for the investors to enable the supply chain to scale up. And we do that in Asia Pacific and also in Africa, but we have also been doing some work in Latin America and the MENA region, and we aim to expand and build more activity in both those regions as well. So that's a little bit about GGI. Next slide, please. I think today, one of the important things that we're doing is we're helping share that knowledge and, bringing, acting as a platform to share the knowledge of the work that's been done by PSR, SE for All, and UNSCAP here, and share it with a wider audience, because, it's through this learning and sharing that we can all go faster. So that's a little bit about us. What I'd like to do now is hand over to Dan Hamza-Goodacre from the Pooled Fund for International Energy, who commissioned the work. And Dan, you can tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing and why you've commissioned this work. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks, Marcus. Quick sound check. Hear me okay? Yep, wonderful. Okay, so firstly, a big thank you to GGI for hosting the webinar today, and for everybody who has joined in. I hope you find this really valuable, and we definitely are keen to hear your questions and comments. Give you a quick bit of background, and then I wanted to make 3 points. In terms of background, as Marcus said, I work for the Pooled Fund for International Energy. It's part of a sort of field of climate philanthropy. Our particular focus is on clean energy solutions, and we provide grants to civil society and other organizations to help scale up clean energy, with a focus especially in emerging markets and developing economies. And like many others, we have increasingly realized that grids are a bottleneck for the reasons that Marcus just highlighted on the previous slides. And have set about seeing how we can help. How can climate philanthropy make a contribution to these challenges? This is in advance of launching a global philanthropic collaborative to really try and scale up the amount of support that's being provided for work on grids. So the grants that will be provided to different organisations for some of the solutions that we'll inevitably talk about today, and some of the things that Marcus has already touched on. And the philanthropic collaborative will go public later on this year. So watch this space. That's the background. In terms of the 3 points I wanted to make, firstly, why we thought this was important. It's that sort of old saying of you can't manage what you can't measure, and in that regard, we felt the need for the creation of baseline data to understand the health of grids, as per the title of the webinar today. How healthy are grids around the world, and what does healthy mean? And in order to answer that question, we thought there'd be a need to identify indicators of grid health, and then to set about collecting data against those indicators and pull that together in a consistent manner. So one can look across countries in different regions in the world. Now that will help us to understand where we are. It'll help us to understand what's working and what's not working, what the gaps are, and therefore what some of the work is that needs to be done. It will also be really helpful in terms of monitoring progress, and that can be both progress at the global level in relation to, for example, the Global Grids and Storage Pledge, which is a sort of aggregated goal of the 25 million kilometres by 2030, but also at the national level as governments pursue their specific agendas for decarbonisation and for delivering reliable, secure electricity to their customers. So repeating these kinds of studies on a fairly regular basis, annually, seems fairly sensible, can help us to understand progress against both global and national goals. And will inform what needs to happen. And that's not just from our parochial philanthropic perspective, but that's what needs to happen in terms of the policies that governments need to make, the tweaks to operations from system operators, the investment choices that financiers are making. And these reports are a really good start in that regard. And we encourage your feedback today and afterwards, particularly in relation to what data do these different stakeholders need, and why, and how can we improve? So that's the first point. The second is a sort of a larger question, really, which I also invite feedback on, which is better grids data will help us to make better decisions about grids and how we modernize them, how they're upgraded, how they're operated to balance in a better, smarter way. But better grids data won't solve all the challenges. So an understanding of what problems won't we solve just through better grids data is also an interesting question. For example, we're probably not going to solve the challenges of really high interest rates in some developing countries through better grids data. So understanding what the data will help us for and the cost and benefits of that, and then being clear where we need to find solutions elsewhere. That's the second point I wanted to make. And then the third is about the way in which we've undertaken this study, which is to look at 3 really important regions in the world and to assess around 12 countries in each region, so sort of towards 40 countries being looked at. We had quite a lot of discussion around comparing countries, and we shied away from it because it's quite complicated, even if one standardizes the data, and there's always the risk of countries not liking how they're being compared. That said, by giving a view across lots of different countries in different parts of the world, it does allow us to infer particular levels of progress or otherwise from one country to another, and I think that's both fine and also really helpful. So again, an encouragement about what can we infer from what we understand happening in one country in terms of where there's likely to be opportunities to progress more quickly in another country. So inference is really interesting. Where can we do better? What do these studies tell us about where we can collectively do better? So that's my third point. I just want to say a thank you also to SE for All, to UN SCAP, and to PSR for this really important work. Well done, all of you. I know we were kind of exploring new ground here. I hope these reports are really helpful for the wider stakeholder community, and I very much look forward to the discussion this afternoon. Marcus, back to you.
Thank you, Dan. Yes, absolutely. And I think though, what can we infer from this? I say we ran this webinar earlier today for the more eastern time zones, and I think there was a huge amount of interest in getting hold of the data, and what we can infer from it did come up quite a bit. So absolutely key points there, Dan. Right, I think we should get into the presentations now. So I'm going to invite Amanda Fernandez, who's head of network studies for PSR, to present the first set for Latin America. Amanda, over to you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay, good to know. So hi everyone, I think it's good morning for some, good afternoon for others, and good evening for another part. So I'm Amanda Fernandez. I work at PSR for the past almost 8 years now, and I'm going to present what we did regarding the Latin America. What are the grid indicators that we have proposed and we have measured to measure the health of the grid of this region. So starting with the methodology, this is the countries that we have analyzed. We have analyzed 12 countries in the region, so it's not all the region that was analyzed. And the idea was to structure what were the indicators that we would need to measure these 5 key dimensions when we are talking about grids and we are talking about energy transactions. So regarding the dimension of renewables, the quality and accessibility, the reliability of the systems, the flexibility, and the other strategic aspects. When creating these indicators, when creating these methodologies, the first point was studying each of those countries, trying to understand how the electricity market work, what were the entities involved, the regulators, the planners, and the operators, and what were the data that those public sectors they had to inform. So we could create a methodology, a framework with indicators in a way that would have to be scalable and would have to be replicable. So finally, after making this analysis of each country in deep details, we have arrived to this first proposal, not final, of indicators for each of those key 5 dimensions. So regarding renewables, we propose to measure what's the renewable participation power generation separated from the variable renewable energy power participation power generation, also in the installed capacity of each of those countries. What's the CO2 emissions regarding the generating electricity, and whether if these countries they have the decarbonization target and what it is. Regarding quality accessibility, we try to measure what is the losses, how long it's been taking to build the transmission assets, the electrification rate, how much the line is growing in each of those regions, especially compared to the demand, and the efficacy of the generator access process. So we did the same for the other aspects, reliability and flexibility. When reliability, we are trying to measure the quality indicators, SAI, the classical ones, the occurrence of major disturbance. And regarding flexibility, we made a more deep analysis, especially of the duck curves of the countries, considering this early net demand ramp. Also the curtailment of the variable renewable energy. And also if these countries, they have the demand response programs, and yes or no question. The other strategic aspects that we, when analyzing, thought would be useful to try to understand how the systems are is understanding the cross-border electricity exchanges. So in Latin America, we don't have a regional market except for the the Central America, but we do have some cross-border electricity exchanges, so we are trying to capture them to see what they are, what's the capacity, and how has been exchanged from one country to another one. The other key aspect that we thought we analyzed was about the data availability of each country, because as Dan was saying, no data, no measure, so we cannot make a final solution, not data-driven analysis. And another aspect that we thought it was important is analyzing if the country has a medium long-term vision for the electrical system, if that's public for the sectors and for the people interested, the stakeholders involved in that country. So one of the aspects here, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, is that not necessarily all the indicators, they have quantitative data, because sometimes it was not feasible to find all the data that we needed to make an analysis. For example, in the occurrence of major disturbance, the blackouts, we do find situations of each country that happened the blackouts in the past 5 years, but sometimes we don't have specific data about these blackouts. For example, the time of recovery on the amount of the load that was lost during this kind of blackouts. And those were two important data that we think to measure the resilience of those grids, but they were not available across the country. So it's one indicator that it's a more qualitative, because we are just mentioning in the past 5 years during the research, what were the major disturbances that happened in each country. Here is a few examples of how the indicators are showed in the material, how they are presented. You can access the full material through this QR code. For example, we have tried for all the indicators getting the data from 2029 up to 2024. I have here the first example for Chile, the variable renewable energy participation in the power generation. So it's a country that went from 2029 with 15% of participation of these variable renewable energies, basically wind and solar. And in 2024, they have achieved 35%. Regarding the cross-border electricity exchange, for example, in Argentina, it's a country that has electrical interconnections with all its neighbors. And here I'm presenting how much it's being imported and exported through those interconnection exchanges through the years from 2029 up to 2023. Another indicators that we have presented, it's the hourly net demand ramp. Here I'm presenting the one from Brazil, but basically we got all the hourly dispatch of the countries in the past year, in 2024. For some countries it was 2023, to create this hourly net demand ramp of the whole year. And then we've selected the days with where we see that the ramp was greater to present in the report, so we can see a little bit of this duck curve of each country of how it's going. So for example, here in Brazil, we have the day, I think was October here, I'm not quite sure, that the maximum peak demand, if I look at the graph, it's 90 gigawatts. But if I look the net demand, so if I don't consider the solar and the wind, this net demand, I had a ramp of 36 gigawatts. So that's something that we think will be useful to keep accessing and analyzing through the years to see how this goes. Now, finally, the key findings that we have in the material. The first one, like I said, it's the limited data and availability and quality. So we do have that some countries offer open access and regular updated, but other ones, they have limit public information, reporting gaps or out-of-date figures. So for example, for some indicators, we have for a few countries, the data is up to 2024. For other indicators, we have only 2023. So this kind of disparity can limit the standardization of indicators calculations. Another key finding I think we had in the region is about the renewables participation. It varies across the region. So we have some countries with a strong presence, while others are still in the early stages. But also in the indicators, we have access when possible, the future expansion plan of each country, and we can see that for all the countries, they are expecting to increase this penetration of renewables in the medium to long term. And one thing that I think it's important that you have found, it's about the long-term vision, especially regarding the grid and regarding the energy transaction. Planning is essential to prepare a system to receive these renewables. So we see that some countries, they have a strong governance and planning and making regional integration, but other ones don't. So there are countries, for example, that we could not access the transmission planning of this country to understand of where it's going, of where they're expecting to go and how they're expecting to prepare the grid to receive these renewables. Now, just to sum up about the next steps, one thing that's important here, that the study is trying to define a methodology for accessing this overall health of the grids across the region. It's an initial assessment of the state of the power grids. I think we have an open forum to refine these indicators, methodologies, and data based on feedback. The idea is that the finding that you can have through these data can support strategic decisions and sometimes highlight some areas needing policy attention. I think that more than comparing the countries, what we expect with these materials that one country can learn from each other. So I can see the data of losses of all the countries and see if there is a country that the losses are decreasing, if that's a problem in some particular region. And the data also can help the investors to make their assumption data when analyzing a new investment. So I think that's what I had for today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda. Fascinating, and it's really great to see how this work is coming together. And I really like the example you show there in Brazil with the impact on solar and ramp rates, and countries which don't have that level of solar at the moment, can learn from how to deal with that, that flexibility and things like that. So again, these types of examples are really helpful. And as you said, one country can learn from another, and that's the intent here. So thank you so much. I'm going to take us over to Brian now, Brian Dean, who's the Director for Energy Transition for SE for All, and he's going to talk us through the work that they've done looking at the metrics within Africa. So over to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you, Marcus. And that point of learning from countries that have a lot of renewables in the grid already, that will certainly be very useful for the African countries. So hopefully you can see my screen, and what you'll see at the bottom is a link to our grids page on our website. In that page, you will find the PSR report, you'll find the UNSCAP report, and the SE for All report. You'll also see the mini grids, the status of mini grids report, and also information on the COP29 Global Energy Storage and Grids Pledge. So go to that page. It's got a lot of good information to bring this all together. We will also be adding the Global Grids database in that link in the near future as well. At SE for All, our main guide is achieving Sustainable Development Goal number 7. And as GGI says, there's no transition without transmission. So we firmly believe that achieving the Global Energy Storage and Grids Pledge is fundamental to achieving decarbonization of the grids and the Paris Agreement, and all of our pledges on renewables and energy efficiency. So we are looking to drive data-driven decision-making towards the achievement of all of that. Okay, I want to start off with some common opportunities that we saw after looking through all the data and information for countries in Africa. So the pilot countries that we looked at were Egypt, Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia. And what you see there is there's a couple of more advanced countries, and then really a lot of really high growth countries. And it's that situation that's kind of interesting from a key indicators perspective, and recognizing that it's important to actually look at the energy consumption per capita. And we found that only 2 countries actually have on average, the modern energy minimum level of 1,000 kilowatt hours per person per year. And that means that there's needs to be a lot of growth in terms of both energy supply and the expansion of the grid, just simply for social development, but obviously that results in economic development and gives an opportunity. All that growth gives an opportunity to maximize flexibility early, so that those grids can actually handle variable renewable energy. Then in terms of the grid development, we've also seen that it's uncommon currently for there to be renewable development zones and corridors. And so that's something that can be added in quite effectively, hopefully, in the near future. And having the right planning and pricing mechanisms in place, it will be really important so that the investments can happen. On the grid operations side, there's the most important thing here, I would say, is the digitalization. So having digital infrastructure in place to enable the grids and the consumer services to be communicating with each other, and having the codes there to enable the countries and utilities to come together with these more advanced grids as they're expanding. So sort of modern grids, of course. Regarding the last one, in Africa, there's a lot of countries that have relatively poor efficiency of the grids, and so it's going to be really important to reduce those grid losses, both transmission and distribution, reduce those technical and commercial losses, and then, of course, significant opportunities across the whole continent to have interconnectors, and having clear operational charge rules is a fundamental opportunity right now. So going back towards the data side of the story, what we've done is we've collected data on every country globally, and so the database that we have and that we want to make public and put online has around 150 indicators or so, of which 33 were considered to be key indicators for Africa, which is a little bit more than we worked very closely with UNESCAP on this. There's a few additional indicators in Africa compared to the Asia analysis. But these key indicators were then split across 5 different categories: policy and market structure, grid development, grid operations, the services to consumers, and the sustainability of it. And across each of these, you'll see that we've got relatively good data availability for policy and market structure, grid services to consumers, and the sustainability side. But it is probably the meat of the issue, which is the grid development, grid operations. That's really the key part of investing in grids. This is where there's some data gaps in terms of the publicly available data. Now, some of this may be because the data is held in the government and they're not releasing it for public, or it could be that they are not collecting it. And by working with countries, you can dig in to really understand what data they have and how to potentially capture all of the data types that are useful in identifying investment and policy opportunities on grids. So Dan mentioned that we're not comparing countries, but that having all this data together allows us to look at things together. And this is a interesting visualization that we did about halfway through the project when we were still planning on comparing countries. But I've removed the countries because it still tells an interesting story in terms of where, and this is the first 8 countries that we worked on, where those first 8 countries are in terms of each of the 5 categories. Now, green at the top means they're doing pretty well and probably not a particularly high priority for global support. And the ones at the bottom means it's really kind of a critical priority and that they need a lot of support. So what you'll see is that grid services to consumers in particular is a really weak spot for these countries. And this includes things like access to energy. It includes the losses, the cost of energy to the consumer, all of those sorts of things, which there's some really traumatic swings across countries in some of these factors that make grid services to consumers the weakest. But also grid operations, policy, market structure, there's really plenty of opportunity for growth and improvement. And, you know, I want to work with the community to really figure out how this type of framing could be useful from an international programmatic perspective, while not actually comparing countries, and then instead working with the countries on their data to identify the policy and investment opportunities in country. So that's how I sort of see the framing of the use of this data. Now, looking at the actual data types, these are current, you know, this slide shows the global high and low. And obviously these are, you know, the real extreme data points. And so we recognize an opportunity to not just look at the, you know, the first percentile and the 100th percentile, but instead actually add some additional factors in here in terms of the database to understand, you know, in this, like the renewable energy share in the power mix, 97.7% is the high and 2.7% is the low. But what's average, what's 75th percentile, what's 25th percentile, that also adds really good information to help understand where countries are at. There's a lot of NAs here, not because all data is not available, but because we don't have data on every country. We certainly have transmission capacity, transformer capacity, transmission circuit length. We have those for many countries, but because we didn't have a significant portion of data for the whole globe, we put NA in there for now. But as the database becomes available, you'll be able to sort through the data and see some additional data points you can compare. So yeah, coming soon in terms of, you know, some of what we're looking to do moving forward is to build out this global grids database. We have it in our systems, but it's not publicly available. When we make it publicly available, we will show where the data is from and be very accountable to making sure that everybody knows how to improve the data moving forward as well. And, you know, the key message from SE for All is that, you know, healthy electricity grids are critical for achieving sustainable energy for all. And as the energy systems evolve, we need strong grids and mini grids to be the backbone of the decarbonized world, enabling climate resilience, energy security, and economic growth. And to do that, obviously, we need future-ready grids and future-ready mini grids that are adaptable, shock-resistant to climate impacts, capable of integrating growing shares of variable renewable, that are intermittent and bidirectional. And, you know, so by looking at the data, I think, and information on the countries, you'll see in Africa, there's really this opportunity to grow and future-proof while driving both economic and social development. So with that, I will hand it back over to Marcus.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, again, a really, really interesting presentation. And, you know, as you said, we're not trying to directly compare countries, but being able to see the differences across those areas and the spread is, I think, is quite fascinating. And, you know, and it tells, you know, it really helps tell the story. And, you know, I was just reflecting on that, you know, in those countries you surveyed, there's strong ambition on the one side, and yet there's some critical areas that needs support or there's greater opportunity, and that, you know, and that's super useful in itself in terms of thinking about, you know how you know, the international community may be able to help and you know, work with those countries on particular areas. So you know, the more we measure this stuff, I think the more insight we get. So thank you for that. So now going to bring us to our third presentation, to cover the area of Asia the Pacific, and I'm going to welcome Anna Lebanova, who is the energy connectivity expert within the UN Economic and Social Commission for Asia the Pacific. So Anna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and I hope you can see my screen. And
we can
with this,
see and hear you.
Perfect. And with this, I'm going to present the work what we did in ASCAP. And being the last speaker helps a lot, because I don't need to start with why this problem is important. You and other colleagues greatly covered this issue, so I can just go straight to the point. Our methodology is very similar to what Brian just presented, because as he mentioned, we worked very closely together with C4All while we developed the methodology. At the same time, there are some differences between Asia Pacific and African region, and this lead us to difference in key indicators which we selected. But the key idea was very similar. First, we analyzed the broad range of indicators, and within that range, we selected the key indicators which we further presented in the report. And we followed key principles: scalability, adjustability, and replicability, meaning that more indicators can be added to the research further on, because we see our key goal was to raise an awareness and to build consensus on straightening power grids. And this is the first and pilot exercise. We very much believe that this is just the beginning of and the starting point of the further research. So we want this work to be scalable. Then we want this work to be adjustable. And as we mentioned before, each region has its own features. So it's important to include some other indicators in one region and maybe remove them without necessity from the other region. And then replicability. Because in our research, we've focused on the number of countries, whereas our capacity was just simply limited and we could not cover everything, even though we really wanted. So this research can be replicable in further countries and in further analysis. Then based on these key indicators, we found key learnings and next steps for further analysis and identify regional developments in Asia Pacific region. And on the screen, you can also see a number of countries which we analyzed, and you may wonder why this list is so different. And the answer is very simple. ASCAP covers 53 countries all across, from Turkey to the Pacific countries. So we try to pick countries from each sub-region and also have countries both from developed and developing countries. Here on the screen, you can see key indicators which we selected for Asia and the Pacific region. And the areas we looked at are very similar to what were presented. So first, we looked at where the countries are in terms of energy transition. What is the share of renewables, and what is the demand supply side? Then we looked at the grid development, mostly focusing on the transmission side there. Then grid operations to see losses and tariffs. We looked at consumer and demand side to see if there are public consultations available in the country and what's the resilience and safety situation. And finally, we looked at the distribution side, and here it's important to mention that the data for transmission more widely available compared to the distribution in our region. So the key findings we have in Asia Pacific. It is important to say that they're very similar to what were presented from Latin America and African region. First, in the main message we have is limited data availability in the region. I'm not saying that the data is not available. No, data is there, but sometimes they are not comparable. Sometimes there are some discrepancies between different sources of information. And while we did our analysis, we looked at all possible publicly available data sources, meaning that we looked at international organizations' data as well as national statistics. And sometimes we see that this two does not match. And especially when you have the third one of someone's analysis, then you can have three different numbers for the same index. And this brings us to the question that sometimes data is not very reliable. Then, of course, we have some data gaps. And here, I would say there are some patterns which we found in our region, including that generalizing, in more developed countries, power sector is usually operates on market-based structure, and there you have tendency to have more open source data and more reliable data, whereas in vertical integrated power systems, unfortunately, we have less data availability. And one of the reasons for that, because some countries just don't share data publicly. It doesn't mean that they don't have this data. They do, because they operate somehow, but they just, they're not keen to sharing this data with others. They keep it to themselves for different privacy reasons. And then coming into key findings in developed and developing countries, the challenges are quite different. Even though we tried, again, echo what my colleagues said, tried not to compare countries among themselves, we still saw some commonalities between groups of countries. And in developed countries, the challenges are more related to technical issues or even public opposition to some project and challenges related to project approvals. Whereas in developing countries, the issues are quite different. And the first and the main one is finance issue, which Marcus was talking about before. And it's simply related to the higher risks for investors and unknown policies and difficulties in investment climate, as well as limited private sector participation. So we see these commonalities between group of countries, but again, each country shows quite different challenges among themselves as well. And what are the key lessons learned from our analysis? First, as I mentioned before, this is just a high-level overview with the idea to raise an awareness. But what it showed us is that creating this simple and scalable framework to assess grid readiness is feasible and possible, and it is an important step. Then, of course, country comparison is limited due to the reasons what we just discussed and what the previous speakers mentioned. At the same time, we still believe that it's important to put countries together in one Excel sheet, not with the idea to compare, but with the idea so that countries look at each other and possibly find some commonalities, and with the idea to learn from each other and to learn best practices and trying to find the solutions together. As a next steps, we are looking at possible stakeholder consultations to fill in data gaps. And of course, as I mentioned, our work was limited by our capacity, and it would be great to have a look at a broader range of countries. And as a next steps, this was the exercise to create a baseline for where the countries are at current stage. Because as Dan mentioned at the very beginning of our webinar, that having all these important goals and trying to find the solutions how to achieve them, the first step is very important to see where we are now, where the countries are in terms of their grid development, and from there to plan the next steps. So this type of exercise and assessment very much helps with that. Then we hope that certain assessment will help countries with their energy planning and investment prioritization, moving further with their national priorities. And of course, we would very much want to hear from the stakeholders and from experts on what the next steps you think we should take in terms of the further analysis and what are the important priorities for you. With this, I finished my presentation and I would be happy to reply any questions you may have further. Thank you. And Marcus, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Again, interesting observations, and there's subtle differences between the regions as well. But the access and quality of data is always an interesting question. So we've got some time now for Q&A. I see some questions coming through in the chat. So I'm going to pick those out and I'll ask them to the three panelists, and we will take it from there. So I think the first question I saw that came through, oops, move my chat along, is, yes. So have you considered in your research parameters, like nominal transmission capacity to peak load and nominal transmission capacity to installed variable renewable energy? Do you think it is valuable to analyze these? So,
I'm
Amanda,
happy to start.
You were first. Oh, you're first. Anna, you've got your mic open. Go for it then. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had my mic still on, so I thought that I might start. Sorry for jumping in. But yeah, I think generally it is a great idea to include them, and I may have a look in the initial Excel spreadsheet what we had with all the indicators we considered. But what we run into, the issue with what we run into is the data availability. And these indicators were simply not available for some of the countries in Asia Pacific region. That's why they were removed. And being ambitious, we would really want to include more detailed indicators into the analysis. But I believe further consultations with countries will be needed to fill in these gaps.
Thanks, Anna. Has Amanda or Brian got a view on that question, or Amanda? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can jump in. Thanks so much for the question. I think it from our side, we first thought about comparing the extension of kilometers of transmission lines to the peak load, but regarding the Latin America, the size of the regions were quite different. And we thought that maybe in the end, a better indicator would be comparing the growth of the extension of transmission lines compared to the growth of the peak demand. And that's what we did at the first place. But looking at your question, I think maybe something related to the variable renewable energy, just the way that we did for demand, could also be useful. So I have to go back to the spreadsheet and analyze, and maybe it's a good idea. So thank you, and for the question, for the suggestion.
Yeah, and from the SU for All side, absolutely, it's worthwhile looking at it. It depends on the questions you're looking to answer from our perspective. So I think if the data is available and if the data quality is good, then we can answer lots of different questions by putting multiple data types together, like you're suggesting, and obviously the transmission capacity, the transformer capacity, the renewable capacity, the base load capacity, the variable renewables, putting all those together in different infographics and analytics would be, I think, quite useful for some investment decisions and policy decisions. So yeah, back to you, Marcus.
Thanks, Brian. I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think once you start getting the data, you think of more things that you can do with it, and more data you will want. So, data breeds data, I guess, in some respects, but, you can manipulate it in certain ways. It can tell you some really insightful things. So I think, as we said, this is a pilot, and, it's great to get the feedback and the learning and see how this can be useful. But, absolutely, when there's, networks and grids are quite different configurations. You might have a long thin grid or a short fat grid, for better expression. The metric would look quite different. Okay, I'm going to next question up I've got here is, I think it related to when Brian was speaking, looking at the differences between the key areas of development, and it says, what could be the reason for declined rate of grid development, ecosystem and grid operations? Is it a lack of technical resources like engineers on decision making? So Brian, I'll let you start with that one, I think, and then the others can come in.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one because, this is where a lot of the technical indicators of the actual grids, transformers, and systems are. I think there's probably a number of reasons. In some cases, it may just be that they have the data within the utilities and they're not sharing it, or maybe not making it public. Or if it is public, it might be in a paper report somewhere, or just not widely accessible. So so the way that I see a lot of this is, there's some things that are in national documents that are accessible, some things are in national documents that are inaccessible, and then ideally a lot of the international partners where a lot of this data is pulled together. So into the IEA, World Bank, UN, the WEF, and others, there's a bunch of data that is brought into the international community. And I think we just maybe need to make a concerted effort to get the rest of this data into the international community. I don't think it's because of a lack of skills in the country. I think utilities have an understanding of this, and they may not be reporting it publicly. I don't know if Amanda or Anna have other perspectives in their regions, and if they saw similar data availability gaps, possibly.
Yes. I think that one of the things that we notice, I don't think it's like the lack of technical resources, like you said, Brian. I think they have all the data because they operate in the system. Maybe it's not just available yet. And I think one of the things that sometimes it's not available, it's because they don't have a market that's requiring this kind of data. Because maybe it's a state-aid market, it's not a private one with competition, because then when you have competition, you have to minimize the asymmetry of information. And for example, here in Brazil, when we started to have the curtailment problems in 2021, the market started to require from the operator the curtailment data to make it public, to see of what we are losing. So I don't think it's because we don't have the technical, but maybe just the market is not requiring yet. I don't know, Anna.
Yeah, I totally agree with you and Brian in terms of the reasons. And one more to mention is simply some of the data is considered confidential in the countries which we analyzed. And that's the reason why it's not public, for some historical reasons, or just simply, as Amanda, you mentioned, that there's no market need for that, as in our region, we see a lot of vertical integrated market structure of the power sector. So there is no need for countries to share data with anyone, so they keep it to themselves. So that's what we see in Asia Pacific.
Thank you all. Yeah, and I think that's a key point, isn't it? Really, that if there is another need for this data to facilitate the market, you're likely to have greater transparency. But where there's not, the organisations aren't readily sharing it because they don't need to. So that kind of makes sense. One question I thought of about that was, when you're working with government, how receptive are they to sharing this data if it's not already shared? Were there any particular challenges or concerns with sharing the data, or when you spoke to them, were they more open?
So in the countries that we reached out to for this, many were quite busy and weren't able to respond. But the one that was able to dig into it with us, they're very open. And I think once they see that we're here to help as a community, they are actively looking to make sure that their data is accurate. And so I think they're quite open, and if they have the data, they want to share it, unless there's some national security issue, of course. But yeah.
Yeah, we see a very similar situation in Asia Pacific, and not necessarily for this report, though we did some consultations prior to data collection with countries, but we have experience with other reports as well, where we send it to countries for peer review so that they check data, and usually they're very responsive because they want to see real picture, and they want to see real situation and what's happening in their country. That's why usually they're very happy to correct us if they have national data which is different compared to international statistics and so on. So unless, as Brian mentioned, it's a confidential data, the countries are usually quite responsive.
Yes, I believe the same here in Latin America.
Right, so definitely they're interested in accuracy of their representation. So that's super helpful. Right, let's go back to some more questions that have come through on the chat, Ben. So there's one here from Jenny. Let's see, I'm wondering whether has anyone looking at metrics and data regarding land use, emissions reductions, and cost effectiveness of different transmission investments. For example, power density along transmission rights of way, production cost savings, lower line losses, and thus reduced emissions from enhanced grids, etc. Yeah, so who would like to go have a go at that one and share what you came across?
So I think
Ryan.
many of those indicators are in the broader 150 or so, and to sort of reframe, there's like a list of 150 that we started with. We worked with UNSCAP at boiling down 50 of the key indicators from that 150. We boiled that 50 down to about 25 to 30. And but within that greater 150, we've got most of those. I think the land use one, it was considered, but I don't think it's in the final list at the moment. But absolutely, it's an important aspect of the actual investment. And I've long been thinking about how to address land use for some of these public infrastructure projects. But yeah, for sure, the other ones, they're in the broader list. And, again, it depends on what question you want to answer. The key indicators that we've picked out are useful for most policy and investment decisions on high-level grid decisions, but you need a lot more detailed information of the actual systems to make true project investments decisions. Yeah, that's it from my side.
Yeah, as the idea was to go broader and to provide high-level overview. In the final list of indicators, we did not go much into details, but yeah, we as Brian mentioned, we had a look at some of them in the broader list. Land use wasn't in ASCAP list. We didn't look at that one, and then the selection process was basically based on a couple of parameters, including usefulness for the goal of what we're trying to achieve, and also data availability, so that we don't have too many gaps in the final report. Because some of these indicators are quite specific, and unfortunately, we didn't have them for all countries, and we just simply didn't want to have not available in the spreadsheet in too many places. So we picked the ones which can show the picture of what we're trying to achieve.
Perfect. Just thanking for the suggestions and the ideas. I think that sometimes we propose those indicators, but from those indicators we can access the other ones. For example, the reduced emissions. We have the total emissions of each country over the years. But regarding the land use, I think it was a very good idea. We haven't looked at that, so maybe in the future, and the next analysis we can go deeper on this. And I will definitely look the material that you have sent, so we can see how we can work and get a better view on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, just moving down through the questions, and a quick one here on how were mini grids treated in the analysis and their role in reducing losses associated to national grids? Wow.
Yeah, I suspect that
Brian?
was mostly from me. Yeah, Victor, thanks for the question. Good to have you on board here in the call. So on the mini grid side, even with Africa, it didn't make it into the key indicators because they are still relatively small regarding the overall picture. That said, I think we have 3 indicators for mini grids as part of the overall database. And so when there's decisions being made in terms of the hard to reach communities, last mile, mini grids data points should be used to understand the cost effectiveness of mini grids compared to grid extension. So I think that's really the fairest way to say it, but that the majority of the actual electricity delivered is via the grid. So the key indicators are very heavily on grid. But I know this has been quite of interest to Dan as well, how mini grids fit into this overall equation, and that's why we try to balance out our messaging between the grids and mini grids in the commentary. So
not sure for us, mini grids didn't make cuts as well. Let's put it this way. And in our analysis, we mostly focus on grids in general. And though for our region, for Asia Pacific, mini grids play very key role when it comes to island nations, when it comes to Pacific countries. That's where, but in our analysis, we didn't include Pacific countries. And there was a simple reason for that, because they are very different from what we're trying to say. And even though grid development is very important for the Pacific, that's where mini grids play the key role. And the situation is just completely different. And for the purpose of analysis and for the messaging, right now we just removed Pacific as a group of countries, not because they are not important, but because they are very different. And we would be very happy to continue analysis in that region if there is interest and resources for that.
Good. For Latin America, we haven't accessed the mini grids topic. It's not something that's very common. I mean, some countries, they have some specific situations and a specific island, but so that's why overall we have focused our analysis in the national grids.
Thank you. Okay, just reading through the questions. There's a question on, do you have any training for national associations so we can be more literate regarding grid constraints and what is needed to overcome them politically? So I've got an answer to that, actually.
Yeah, that one's for you.
So we run a training program called the Electricity Transition Playbook. I'll just put the link in the chat. It is for policymakers to help them think about the energy transition and frame it. And it's available online, but we also host in-person training sessions as well. So have a look at that. It might not answer all your questions, but it helps you think about how to look at it, and also includes case studies from various countries that have been successful. So I'm happy to share that one. There was a point around green grids is an amazing concept, but being an electrical engineer, I can confirm green grids comes with a lot of problems in related power quality and reliability. How can we overcome these challenges? And should we focus on grid financing rather than only pushing green financing? I'm happy to have an answer to that, but I don't know if anybody else would like to have a go at that one as well.
Go for it first, Marcus. I might add on.
Yeah, so I think ultimately grids are going to be green because they're there for the long term, and electrification is the long-term solution for the bulk of the energy that we're going to use if we're going to keep emissions or bring emissions down to a sustainable level. So I think the challenge around some grids is that they're not green enough to attract that financing at the moment, which is why we're working on trying to change the rules to do that financing. And that's an important point. And the green bit, if you can get concessional financing in, it reduces cost of capital. It can de-risk part of the project, which allows traditional financing then to come in, and private financing in particular. So it's a balance of bringing those in. So I would argue that in terms of reliability and how do we overcome those challenges, I think personally, the way we're approaching it is finding what's working in various countries and sharing that, and looking at the technologies that are being used, the mechanisms for forecasting the energy use, the ways to digitalization. And Brian managed digitalization, using digitalization to help manage the grid and bring in things like demand side. So it is all about different nations and different system operators and countries learning and sharing that knowledge really to overcome these challenges. Because I agree. I come from a system operator myself, and usually the first person who says you can't deliver the renewable energy is a system operator, because they are focusing on trying to make sure the energy is reliable and firm and keep the customers connected. So it is about working with those organizations and sharing that learning. So that's what we're trying to do today, and measuring it and measuring this data is a useful step in that journey as well, I would say. But Brian or Anna, I see both of you got your mics up.
Following up on what you're saying, Marcus, I really would like to add here is in terms of learning and what we actually saw today, that the challenges what we have in Asia Pacific, for example, are very much similar to Africa sometimes, or even to Latin America, even though this region on the other side of the globe for us. And I think it's important to learn not only from your neighbors, but sometimes to look further and to see the solutions which are available basically across the globe. And this is I think the importance of such global initiatives. That's where it is, to bring countries or stakeholders from across different regions together. Whereas in ASCAP, we combine 53 countries and we provide the platform for the whole Asia Pacific. But sometimes we don't see what's happening in other regions, but learning cross-regional is very important. And that's what I see from this webinar and what we had in the morning as well.
And just a small add-on from my side is that we fundamentally believe that you just can't do it with one thing alone. So this is why you can't have a reliable grid without energy efficiency. You can't have a decarbonized pathway without renewables. And we're working with utilities in India, as an example, on demand flexibility. There needs to be policies in place that bring energy efficiency to demand flexibility, so that the scale of grids and the scale of renewables that are needed is less, because the actual demands are less, and that you have demand flexibility so that you can actually increase and decrease demands and increase and decrease renewable energy together. So anyway, it becomes a little bit complex, but when you don't rely on any one solution, it becomes easier. Over to Amanda.
Yes, and just adding something from another perspective, I also have a background in electrical engineering, and I have been working a lot with planning transmission studies here in Latin America. So doing all the electrical studies and analysis, trying to understand of how we have to prepare the grid to receive this green energy, because yes, it brings something more complicated to operate and to plan. And one of the things that I believe that are the key to overcome the challenges, like you said, is the improvement of tools and the improvement of capacitation of the planners and of the operators of the system. So have been doing a lot of studies where we are discussing new methodologies, how we can incorporate flexible equipment in the transmission grids, what are the new features that we need on those electrical models, so we can understand of how the grid will behave and what we have to do to prepare, what are the investments, new operation techniques. So I think the tools and capacitations are something that are very key on preparing and planning our green grids of the future.
Thank you. Okay, I've got another question here from Anna again, who says, can you say a few words on how the presented analysis is located inside the decision-making pathway for countries, meaning it's mostly dedicated for policymakers to see the picture and start acting rather than for other stakeholders? Is that correct? Get people's views on that.
I think, Anna, really nice seeing you. And you're very much right. The key idea was to raise an awareness for policymakers, to show where the situations are, and to show that there are challenges which are comparable across different countries in the region and outside across the globe. And from there, to start further analysis and to call for further action.
Thanks, Anna. And I think I would chip in that, yes, it's absolutely policymakers are absolutely fundamental in terms of learning this. But, sharing this information can be used by other stakeholders as well, and those that hold policymakers to account as well. I always like to think that, people who are challenging them to do their job, if they've got access to the same information as well, that always makes for an interesting dialogue. So that's my little thought on that. Okay.
And just
right.
that this data is useful for not just the grids people. It's for those that are planning the energy transition, those that are writing codes for the grids and across the board. I think there's you're right, Anna. This is fundamental how this data should be used moving forward. Back to you, Marcus.
Thanks, Brian. Yeah, and I think it's useful for philanthropy or other support organizations that are looking to help these various countries. They can see potentially where the best places are to direct their efforts. I think that's all the questions. There's a point being made around Pakistan, but I don't think there's actually a question there. It's just we have an outdated transmission system, and if we inject more than 7% in our current energy mix, our whole network will collapse. Yet we've committed to 60% renewables. I don't know if the system operator says 7% is the challenge, or whether that's real or not. But I do recall that within the UK, we said we couldn't get more than 10% renewables. 10% solar on our system, not about 10 years ago, and I think we've had about 20% the other day, and up to 80% renewables at some point. So things can change, but I don't know the full situation in Pakistan. So there might be some fundamental reasons there, but as I said at the start, the system operator tends to be risk averse because they are focusing on trying to keep the lights on and keep the system secure. So they need to see how others have done it or are learning how to do it, really, to give them the confidence to move forward sometimes. But I would be interested if anybody else got any comment on that.
Just that I think it's a point for why to do the energy planning and do the investments in the flexibility, digitalization, and the upgrades to the grid. So yeah, it's not about the 60% number. It's about making sure that the grid is flexible and able to handle a lot more. Some grids are at 97% renewables. So
yeah, exactly. Okay. Right. Well, I think we've come to the end of all. All right. So hang on, another question just popped in. How manageable is it to secure the funding of 800 billion for grid upgrades globally? Will there be a country-to-country recommendation for grid upgrades? I suppose that's referring to my opening slides, so maybe I have to answer that one then. So in terms of a country-by-country recommendation, I mean, the 800 billion is a global figure. I think it comes from the IEA, and that will have, obviously some analysis behind it that supports that. I've not seen a breakdown on country by country, but that is down to countries to work out for themselves through their planning, through their commitment to their NDCs, to work through and to see what that looks like, because it is, this is a global problem, but individual countries have got to deliver their own infrastructure. But what they can do is, as we've talked about quite a lot today, is learn from each other and leapfrog some of the issues if somebody is doing it. So from that point of view, and in terms of how feasible is it to get that funding, certainly talking to the finance industry, if you put the right frameworks in place and the rate of return is right, that there is capital out there to do that. I think at the moment there's institutional and systemic barriers that are preventing that from happening, and making grids should be low risk, long-term investments, which should be attractive to pension funds and other types of organizations like that. So if they are not, for various these things that can be done to look at that and make the regimes more stable, and then the investment can come. Okay, so I think that looks like the end of the question. So thank you very much to our presenters for your presentations today. As I said, the slides and will be available afterwards. We'll be putting the recording of the presentations will be on our website, and I think on other websites as well. And Brian indicated that is a great wealth of new information that's going to be on the SE for All website that you can look at. Do have a look at the reports. If you do want to follow up, I think all the presenters are happy to be contacted about their particular reports. We are interested in the feedback and understanding where to take this work next. We think it's really valuable. I think over the course of these two sessions that we've had today, that's coming clearer that there's a lot of interest in this. So please keep in contact, and thank you again, and thank you to our presenters and Mar for organising the logistics behind it as well. So thank you all, and good day.